All right, in this video, I want to talk about applying those principles that you are thinking about exploring or expressing or articulating into a digital context, because there's only so much you can do by trying to do all of this on a notebook. Your hands will just get tired. You'll just run out of pages. Maybe you can't bring a notebook. I don't know, right? Or maybe there are some digital only contexts that you want to have in your graph over time, that just having it all there is just way easier and way faster, because we want to try to make sure that we type at close to the speed of our thinking. So with that being said, let's jump right in. Now, I have a blank, well, this is the Roam FM graph, but I have a graph with no CSS applied, no special themes or anything. But I just want to make a quick video here for applying those principles in a vanilla context as much as possible. So within Roam, make this a little bit bigger. How do we implement our principles? So when we think about principles, we think about things like, what are the things that I should put in my knowledge graph? What are the things that I should write about in my knowledge graph? Oh, I shouldn't be showing that. That's Roam 42. So how do we implement our principles? This outer, so I'm going to focus on outer principles. Outer principles consist of things outside of Roam, or your note-taking app. This is when you look at everything in the world and you decide. Decide when something deserves a spot in your graph or not. And once you articulate or express this, on paper, then you think, okay, if I try to believe in this or if I try to commit to this, then technically, in theory, your graph should be a lot cleaner and more useful for you, because you would only write something in there if it's going to be very, very useful. Now, in theory, that works really, really well. But I don't want to introduce or suggest that level of rigidity, even though it's not that rigid, because sometimes there's serendipity in including irrelevant things as well, as long as they make you feel good when you observe them at face level. And one example of this is things like, one example would be taking notes on something that I'm very, very interested in. Maybe it's my field, maybe I'm in academia, and I'm like, oh, okay, I'm going to need this for my thesis, or I'm going to need this for my project or my team, etc. But then you look at other personal things. It's like, oh, memories of my family. You can try to justify that and say, yes, I do cherish my family. I want to keep that in my graph because my knowledge graph is the culmination of everything that I'm thinking about, so I will keep that in there. Or something like what brand of coffee that I take today, or the weather, or even what dumb YouTube video did I watch today? Do I want to keep track of this, right? Yes or no? Now, if you're committed, this should just not be there. Or maybe this should not be there. Or maybe this should not be there, right? If this graph is specifically for maybe your field, then it's just going to be this. Everything else doesn't really matter. Sometimes you can find different ways of serendipity or different ways of angles to look at what you're trying to pull out from this specific block or this specific piece of information when you look at parallel blocks. And what this means, for example, is if I've read an article on hamburgers, then I had lunch with my family and we had hamburgers. And it was at a place where they only had this specific brand of coffee at this hamburger place during rainy weather. And after that, I watched like Hot Ones or something. Then there is some form of connection there via food. So do you want to have that kind of connection in there? I don't know. This depends on you, right? This is when we start to question outer principles through the adjustment of our inner principles. Now, hold on to that thought because I want to also talk about inner principles for a second. I may have gone off the track in terms of what this video is meant to be helping you with, but essentially what this means is that to try not to be too rigid when it comes to applying your principles, making sure that there's a firm conviction behind believing in them, but when you can try to justify whether or not, yes, these things that you should be writing down or you want to write down will help you in some way, shape, or form, then it's okay to put them down because, your note-taking application will be perfectly fine. This is to combat the rigidity of frameworks that we have referred to online, where there are hard yeses and hard nos to specific ways of looking at something. As an example, if I want to look at an atomic note or a zettel in a Zettelkasten system, there is a format for it. There is a specific way to do a zettel. There are principles. It has its own principles. It has its own rules, right? And what happens is that a lot of people would get too obsessed with formatting to shape that, like to work with that system. But if what you're doing right now is maybe an amalgamation or even a variation of this Zettelkasten or this attempt at this system, but it still works for you, then that's perfectly fine. This is when we start talking about finding our own unique principles to ensure that they are malleable enough that they can fit our context. Yes, they can also refer to other systems, but they are not defined by them. Huge distinction there. Because the search for this series is about writing your own custom setup, I want to introduce to you the many different ways you can angle and explore that, because we're going to try to be experimental here. So yes, we have outer principles, and it, deals with things that we notice, and we bring them in, and we're like, oh, okay, do I want to include this? Yes or no? Why? Why not? Etc., etc., etc. But let's just say that you say yes to everything, and it is included. What do you do then? As mentioned in the previous video, inner principles deal with semantics, how you write things down. How do you make it come up? How do you make it useful? How do you recall these things? How do you ensure that what you've observed will serve you in the way you intend it to serve, whereas if it's not too struck by bias, for example? And how would it serve your current metaphors, analogies, and perspectives of the world? And also how to protect your inner principles so that it doesn't get influenced by other systems a little bit too much, which I just went the whole tirade for a little bit there just now. Inner principles work in a way where if you want to apply your semantics, you need to write them down in a way where it will be very easy to recall them when you need them. Now, your inner principles are yours, but I've noticed that when we try to apply these inner principles to our note-taking systems, there are some common attributes that anything that you bring into your system should follow. One is that it should have when you write something in to your notes, you have to make sure that you've written it with the ability to recall, your ability to research it or recall it later, at a later date. As an example, if you've written something about, cats and the history of cats in human history or something like that, right? Like the correlation between evolution of cat biology and humankind or something like that. You want to write as much as you can so that when you need to surface that up later in the future, yes, these are notes that you've taken during the time and you're thinking, okay, I know I'm going to use this in the future for something, but it's not now. So I will serve my future self by writing it in a way where I can recall when it becomes necessary. Sometimes relevance arrives at a later date. We have to prepare for it, right? It's like it's like preparing for a housewarming. You know there's going to be guests coming in. So when you buy the house, you're like, okay, I want to do a housewarming. There's going to be people coming. I should at least prepare for it, like something like that. So when you have these principles and you're thinking, okay, my semantics are the following. I use these analogies. I use these perspectives. Then I bring something in to my graph and I'm like, okay, how do I write it in a way where I will recall it at a later date so that it will serve me at that time? You have to make sure that things are researchable. So taken from the realm of SEO, it will be like the questions that you start to ask yourself will be things like, some of the questions that you might want to ask yourself when you want to check a note for its ability to be recalled is asking yourself, why do I think this will be useful in the future and not now? The answer to this question can be part of your notes. It will be like, I think this will be useful in the future because the following, da 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 da, right? According to this project, this specific Zettel, this specific note, this person said the following, and a quote from this book. I think it'll be future later on when I do the following project or the following blog post or the following video on this, but for now, I will archive it and just leave it for later. And write that down, right? Document that as much as possible. What are some of the common themes and words I tend to put in the search bar? This is normally the question we use to test or decide whether or not something becomes an entity in your graph. In the context of Rome, it would be, what should I put as a page? There's a number of beginner Rome research users who would talk about best practices for making a page out of something. But then Rome research in particular would distinguish between capitalized and uncapitalized words, singular and plural words. And some people may find agreements and disagreements with that, but I really like the distinction. I really like that there are separate entities because, and as much as I understand that aliases will work really well, the reason why that would work is that you can start to make different formats and structures out of the different distinguished versions of that one word. As an example, I wrote hashtag video, hashtag videos, and then hashtag video with a capitalized V in the very beginning. Depending on what you need in your structure, in your context, some of these can represent different intentions or different semantics depending on their context. The first one, the standard one, could be ideas for video. For me, maybe I have a YouTube channel and I want to write an idea, hashtag video, talking about the following things. The next one is hashtag videos. Maybe videos would be what I have perceived videos, like those videos that I've watched in the, outside world. Maybe I've watched a few on YouTube and I want to write notes about them. This hashtag is specifically made for those videos that are outside pulled in to my graph, and that's how I make that distinction. And then maybe the capitalized V in this video could represent the concept or the medium of video. Maybe it's about the history of video and how it started, etc. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, I have these distinctions and I have these common themes and words. When I search them, will it be confusing? Maybe. It could be. Maybe I need to, instead of putting video, it could be video medium instead. Maybe it could be these specific kinds of videos, right? It could be videos could represent specific kinds of formats in the world of video, or like under the umbrella of video. This question really explores how you search your graph once you're in the middle of like your exploring mode. Once you're done writing and once you're done looking at things, then you're like, okay, let me just review a few things, or maybe I can just explore my own inner world of notes and think to myself, okay, when I use the search bar, what do I do? If I want to find a video, if I want to find a video I'm thinking of making, if I want to find videos that I've watched, what do I type in? These are examples of semantics that you can apply when you're writing down anything or perceiving anything. But in a digital context, you start to notice these very sensitive features or these sensitive points that you have to take into consideration. And as much as I'm being very meticulous or particular about this, sometimes when you're experimenting or creating your own custom setup, you do have to be a little bit particular, because experimenting on how you take notes is not an easy thing to do. It will take a lot of time before you result or conclude with, yes, I think this will fit, or no, I think should just stop doing this because it's pointless, etc. So trying these out, no matter what, would really help you. And another question would be, if I lose this note, will it have a negative effect at a grander scale? For example, for myself, I write a lot of notes that are very free form. And I would write on the parent block #or, so that I can put a checkpoint for that block. And then later on, further down the line, I can see if I want to use it, or if I want to explore it, or if I want to maybe just ignore it completely to see, if it will help me. That takes into consideration how I have regarded or how I have constructed my semantics, in that most of these freeform notes have some common themes. And grander scale in this particular question means, can this note that I randomly wrote today help with that common theme? Let me see if I can find an example on my own personal note. So, as an example, I have my actual graph here, and in this particular note, I've written, between art and science lies music in the middle. I could have just not tagged them in the sentence. I've written or in there so I can add a checkpoint. I can look back at it later. And in asking myself the question, if I lose this note, will it have a negative effect? I don't know, right? I don't know. But my answer to this question may or may not have influence over how particular I should be when expressing or articulating this note or this thought. So as an example, let's explore this. So as an example, I've written this maybe randomly like 2 days ago or something like that. I look at this and I'm thinking to myself, right, if I lose this note, will it have a negative effect at a grander scale? Someday, a future version of me may want to explore music. And I want to explore the relationship between music and myself and the world. So, if I lose this note, will it have a negative effect? I think yes, because I want to articulate music from as many angles as possible. And music is, at least I think, somewhere, it's like a Venn diagram of art and science. And since I believe that it would have a negative effect, if I lose it, then I should do my best to articulate as much as possible, and even page specific points, so that even if I do lose it in the stream of time, maybe 20 years later, I can still look back at the art page, for example, or the science page, or the music page, for example, so that I can resurface this up once again. So as an example, I'm writing blah, 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 and I want to explore this again. I write here, ORS, art, science, music. I use my advanced block search, ORS, art, science, music. Boom, and it comes back up again. It makes it a lot easier for me to recall something if I've written it with proper intention. So that's one example. That example as well works with the next point, which is the ability to apply it. Things like integration. When you write to articulate or elaborate on something, you want to find the different angles in which this can be integrated into other notes. Not only the notes that you believe the fields are common, because, for example, that sentence just now, between art and science lies music in the middle, in that block, I'm trying to argue that these 3 points, art, science, music, have some kind of connection or connotation, etc. I want to explore that. So I forced integration between those three. And I'm trying to justify that forcing. The more that I explore it, the greater the chance of me being able to integrate this with fields that are not mentioned in the parent block or in the child block, or what have you. This becomes very, very fascinating once we start thinking about polymathic levels of thinking, where you just jump the bridge and all of a sudden you're connecting these things, these thoughts, with fields that you never thought would be possible. But then for some reason you have arrived at that point where these fields overlap. And then all of a sudden you can somehow connect music with, I don't know, like politics, or rocket science with perfume. There's going to be some way to integrate that, right? You want to make those parallels. That's what it means by the ability to apply. The thing is, in a digital note-taking context, in order for you to even reach up to that point, in order for you to predict or determine whether or not there is a path towards that integration, you need to write as much as possible. Not only for recall, but also to make sense of your expressions, articulations, elaborations. Going back to this specific example once again, I'm looking at this now, and I want to make sure that my ability to integrate this note with something else is possible or is probable, right? I'm looking at all the words that, or my semantics as to how I'm trying to explore or argue for this point to actually work. Then I could pinpoint specific things and question myself later on at a future date. For this, some words that come out would be, or some words that stand out rather, would be illogical, articulations, expression, rationale, melody, imaginations as well, I think of. Technically, I've already said that. So, if I've written as much as possible, I've exhausted my mad writing mode, and I'm looking at this now and I'm thinking, okay, can I integrate this with anything else? I look at imaginations and I'm trying to think of, is there anything else? Is there anything else that I can integrate into this note? So I try to search imagination. My semantics compel me to think that searching the word in particular is potentially useful because I use that word a lot, imagination. And also searching the blocks for that word can also be useful. And then also searching the word in different forms can also be useful. So it could be searching for imagination, imagining, imagine, and to a certain extent, creativity, fiction, what have you. My inner principles dictate that there could be something here. So if I go to here and I say imagining, what is the relationship between the word imagining, the word art, and the word music? And I go here and just put it under a child block, and I can just format that later. And I say imagining music. No, imagining or. I don't remember where this is from, but let's just say this is a very useful note, and I'm like, wow, that's pretty cool. Can I apply it to this specific sentence? And then I try to explore that over time. So this is an example of integration. This is probably a very poor example of integration because I don't know if this is actually going to be useful. I need to keep going. But you want to increase your surface area of integration, the percentage chance of integration as a possibility. So the way that you write these things would be very, very useful. And the last one would be the ability to maintain context. This is a little difficult to embody because the ability to maintain context, I believe it was Cortex Futura who brought it up. We have context-dependent insight. Most of the time when we look at things like wisdom, insight, knowledge, etc. We perceive something, we see how it works in that context, and then we're like, oh, okay, cool. Let me pull that into my notes. And we extract that information or insight, and then we recognize the most atomic form of that insight, and then we try to apply it elsewhere. Right? That's like knowledge connecting 101. Sometimes some levels of insight only work within that context. It's not good or bad, it just is. We have to make sure that we can discern that between the things that we observe. Maybe this type of exploring, maybe, for example, there's a type of painting or like a type of painting technique that works well in this one context. But then you try to apply that in something else, and then you're like, oh no, this is not working really well, right? It's context dependent, wisdom, insight, value that will only work well within that context. Can it maintain its context? Can it be used anywhere else? Is the question you have to ask here. There is no right answer to this because it depends on what you're looking for. Sometimes you just want to have notes where it doesn't matter if it's going to be in a very closed context, in that I can't integrate it with anything else. It doesn't matter. If it's useful to me, if it's fun to me, if I appreciate it, etc., then that's okay. That's okay. You just have to make sure that when you're experimenting with these things, you start to make an audit, or you take notice of the things that you're taking into your noting system, and you're asking yourself things like, okay, I find this really fascinating, or there's this lesson in this book, and I find it great. If it loses its context, would it still be valuable to me? If the answer is either yes or no, you then have to decide, should it belong in your graph? Now, this goes back to the very beginning, where we were talking about outer principles and how they are shaped by our inner. So adjusting our inner principles to allow for maximum serendipity by breaking the rules of our outer principles. So sometimes things like this is like an indicator of whether something is also useful. Should I keep looking at things that will only work well in this context? Yes or no? If it's yes, then okay. You can always break the rules, change your outer principles a little bit, adjust it, allow for a couple of exceptions, adjust your mental filter to be like, oh, okay. Yeah, sometimes I learn something from watching videos of children playing with like kids' toys, etc. Maybe, right? It could be. Would it work well in a different context? I don't know, but we're about to find out. But then maybe there's going to be some serendipity there when you find or extract or put in supposedly irrelevant things into your knowledge graph. And then later on, once you're in the mood to integrate something, then maybe you can start to see just how wonderful the ecosystem of everything that you've observed works in tandem with your perceptions, your ideas, your thinking patterns, your thoughts. And then that's when you start to build your muscle for polymathic thinking. Yeah, I think this video went all over the place, so I'm really sorry if it's going to be very confusing for you. I did mention my goal with this series is to give you the chance to explore custom setups for your note-taking system, inventing your own principles, finding angles here and there, making sure that your narrative for thinking is not dependent on somebody else to tell you what to do. I don't want to cultivate this understanding that you should be spoon-fed by those smarter than you to create something for yourself. It's best that you try to create your own independent system, experiment with what goes well, experiment with what doesn't go well, and then keep an open mind for adjustments. And that's when you start referring to other people's systems and thinking, oh, okay, I understand the rationale behind why they do it like this. Oh, okay, I understand why they do it this way, but then I agree or I disagree. And that works really, really well, so that eventually your graph will start to look like who you are in written form. And that's how principles should work. So